By the 1870s, the United States of America was the largest economy in the world, surpassing the Empire of Great Britain. And with this enormous wealth came the opportunity to modernize a fledgling U.S. Navy. In the late 1880s, the U.S. Congress had begun to appropriate millions of dollars to build new long-range battleships and other support vessels for the Navy. Soon, top commanders in the U.S. Navy and in Washington became eager to put the new Navy to the test. There was also fervor amongst the public and the press to flex the nation's muscles. Americans began to hear stories of the atrocities of imperial rule, particularly in Cuba, by way of the colorful journalism exhibited in the New York Journal orchestrated by owner William Randolph Hearst. Many began to eye what remained of the crumbling Spanish Empire as the best way to transform the United States into a global player. After a long insurgency in Cuba, which eventually became fully recognized by the United States government, the U.S. Navy dispatched one of their newly christened battleships, the USS Maine, to Havana Harbor on January 25th of 1898. A message to Spanish officials said simply that the Maine had been sent to Cuba to ensure the security of American interests on the island. But just over 2 weeks later, all of that changed. On February 15th, an explosion aboard the Maine, while docked in Havana, destroyed the ship and killed more than half of her crew. Americans were quick to assume sabotage and pointed the finger to Spain and demanded a swift response. It was not long before official declarations of war came from Washington and from Madrid. In the weeks before the USS Maine was destroyed in Havana Harbor, Deputy Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt ordered Commodore George Dewey, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, to sail in the vicinity of the Philippine Islands. Upon hostilities with Spain, U.S. commanders were able to quickly move the U.S. Pacific Fleet against Spain's fleets anchored in Manila. Commodore Dewey was able to easily disable or destroy all Spanish vessels there, giving the United States its first decisive overseas victory. The newly refitted U.S. Navy was able to quickly mobilize blockades of Havana, Cuba, and San Juan, Puerto Rico. But at the onset of hostilities, the U.S. Army was nearly 3 months away from assembling its forces and preparing them for what would be the nation's first seaborne invasion of foreign shores. It was at this time that the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Wisconsin Volunteer Regiments were assembled, beginning on April 28, 1898. Men from all around Wisconsin were transported to Camp Harvey in Milwaukee to await deployment. 2 days later, the volunteer regiments were on their way to Camp Thomas, Georgia, for training. By June 22nd, combat operations in Cuba had begun in earnest, and after just under 2 weeks of fighting in southern Cuba, the U.S. Army, along with Theodore Roosevelt's infamous Rough Riders, had captured the city of Santiago and all but destroyed Spain's ability to defend the island of Cuba. On July 5, 1898, the brigades in which our Wisconsin boys were attached were moved out of Camp Thomas to Charleston, South Carolina to await deployment. 2 weeks later, on July 20th, the 2nd and 3rd Wisconsin regiments boarded transport vessels Grand Duchess and No. 21 and were to sail in the direction of Puerto Rico. Much of the material aboard was destined for General William Shafter, who was known to be preparing for operations in Puerto Rico. However, the exact destination of the troops was a closely guarded secret enclosed in a sealed envelope that General James H. Wilson was not to open until clear of U.S. shores. There was a concern that the remainder of Spain's fleets could pose a threat to the transport vessels en route to Puerto Rico. After the war was over, it was discovered that the Spanish fleet stayed anchored in Spain, as it had become clear that they were no match for the modernized U.S. Navy. The morning of July 22nd saw the first Spanish naval activity in more than a month, as the warships Isabel II and Terror attempted to run the U.S. blockade at San Juan. They returned back to San Juan Harbor, but not before the Terror was heavily damaged. 3 days later, on July 25th, the American invasion of Puerto Rico began, with the 3rd Wisconsin landing, amongst others from Michigan and Illinois, at Guanica. On the 27th, the Wisconsin 2nd landed at Ponce, Puerto Rico's second largest city, and marches into the city unopposed the following day. After securing the 2 landings at Guanica and Ponce, the 2nd and 3rd Wisconsin marched to the northeast and converged on Coamo. After a short engagement and a Spanish retreat, the 2 Wisconsin regiments marched towards Ay Bonita on August 9th for the largest engagement of the Puerto Rican campaign. The Battle of Ay Bonita turned out to be a massively confusing engagement for both sides, as an overheated cannon on the American side led to the assumption by Spanish commanders that they had disabled the American artillery and ordered a charge. Not anticipating a Spanish charge as a result of the overheated artillery, the 3rd Wisconsin reported seeing an additional Spanish regiment in waiting as the Spanish charged their lines. Although there was no 2nd Spanish regiment, Captain Potts ordered the Wisconsin regiment to fall back and conducted a fighting retreat. The battle was mostly inconclusive, but on August 13, 1898, combat operations ended as American and Spanish officials signed the Treaty of Paris of 1898. The treaty formally ended Spain's empire in the Western Hemisphere by ceding their 2 last colonies, Cuba and Puerto Rico, to the United States. Spain further ceded the Philippines and Guam to the U.S. for $20 million. Today, a plaque commemorating the efforts of the 2nd Wisconsin Volunteer Regiment is displayed just inside the front entrance to City Hall in Ponce, Puerto Rico.